Now, there's two types of adverse effects terms that are worth searching. That is the named adverse effect, such as death, fatigue, fracture, insomnia, rash, etc. And these terms are obviously most useful when you know the adverse effects that you're looking for. This is when you have a hypothesis testing review, such as, for example, the review that we did on fracture risk with glitter zones, where we knew that the adverse effect was fracture. We could have searched for cardiovascular adverse events with glitter zones, just as important, or more so. And again, this would have been a hypothesis testing review where we had the named adverse effect. But some reviews, safety profile reviews they're called, or hypothesis generating review, are ones where we're looking at what are the adverse effects associated with intervention X. And in these cases, we don't know them. But as I mentioned, we could think about what adverse effects we expect. So by looking at the biological plausibility, for example, looking in social media and textbooks, and identifying some named adverse effects. But you wouldn't just rely on those named adverse effects. You would also include generic adverse effects terms, such as side effect, harm, adverse effects, complications, because you're also trying to find the unexpected adverse effects. So these generic terms are most useful for when you're searching for unknown adverse effects, although they can still be useful when searching for a named adverse effect. So if we're searching on generic adverse effects terms, as I say, such as harm, complication, adverse effect, etc., we need to think about how to do that. There's lots of fields that you can search. You can search for adverse effects terms as text words, for example, in the title and the abstract. You can search for adverse effects terms as indexing terms, for example, in MESH, in MEDLINE and the Cochrane Library, for example, or in MBase, you could search for the M-tree indexing terms. There's also the subheadings or qualifiers, and these are again in the indexing field, but these are terms such as adverse effects which are linked to an indexing term, and I'll go into more detail in a moment. And lastly, just to say, there are some search filters, or that are sometimes called search hedges, available in the area of adverse effects, although their methodology for developing them has been somewhat basic and they're quite old, but they can give you a good basis, a good starting point in creating your search strategy. So if we look at more detail, this is a MEDLINE record. So here we have adverse events as our text words because it's in the title. We have an indexing term, again, which is relevant to adverse effects, which is adverse drug reaction reporting systems. And we have subheadings that are relevant, namely adverse effects, which actually occurs more than once in the record. So there's lots of different ways that we can retrieve this MEDLINE record. I've already mentioned that there's lots of different terms for adverse effects. The terminology around adverse effects is quite complicated and quite varied. So we have adverse effects that I've mentioned, adverse events that you just saw in that example record, adverse reaction, side effect, harm, risk, safety, complication, etc. So this is just a few examples. There's probably a few more out there. But just to get you started on thinking of what text words you want to search for, what terms in the title and abstract, for example. A word of warning though, some of these free text terms can be very noisy and you end up retrieving a lot of irrelevant records as well as relevant records. For example, the term risk identifies relative risk, which is a commonly used term in a lot of research. The term harm finds a lot of material on self-harm, and safety finds a huge amount of literature on patient safety. And also, even with terms such as adverse effects, lots of papers say things like adverse effects were not considered. Again, which there's no way of getting out of that you'll find if you search for the term adverse effects. As well as free text terms, you also need to think about the indexing terms. Now, I've listed here a few generic mesh terms that are useful, say for MEDLINE or the Cochrane Library. As you can see, they vary depending on the type of intervention that you're looking at. So, for example, for a drug intervention, different types of mesh terms are more relevant than for, say, a surgical intervention or a medical device. And the same goes for MBase. M-tree terms, again, vary depending on the intervention. So here we have drug intervention terms, surgery terms, and device terms, all very different. Now, I've already mentioned subheadings. Subheadings are in the indexing field. And there's lots of useful subheadings in both MEDLINE and MBase, which I've listed a few here. There's two main ways to use subheadings. You can either float your subheading, whereby the subheading can be attached to any indexing term. And for example, in Ovid MEDLINE, AE.FS searches for the subheading adverse effects as a floating subheading, which is what the FS stands for. There are other ones that are useful to use, and again with the .fs at the end. And Ovid MBase has a very similar syntax here. So we can see that we can search AE.FS for adverse drug reaction as a subheading floated. A quite recent subheading, relatively recent, added to MBase is AM.FS, which is adverse device effect, which is worth using if you're searching, for example, a medical device. The other way in which to use subheadings is to attach them to an actual indexing term. This could be the intervention itself. So, for example, aspirin /AE searches for the mesh term aspirin with the subheading adverse effects attached. And you could attach your subheading, if it's something like chemically induced, to the adverse effect itself. So headache /CI in MEDLINE searches for the term headache with chemically induced attached to it. And a similar way of searching in MBase. I've already mentioned search filters, or sometimes called hedges, and these are useful, but I wouldn't use them blindly. As I say, they're very old now, and there are others out there. For example, I think there's BMJ Clinical Evidence have one, but they're CADIF have one, but they're mostly created not with the brilliant methodology that's used for example, creating the RCT filter for Cochrane. They're mostly used by more basic methodology because of pragmatic reasons. And so I would say I wouldn't use them blindly for that purpose, for that reason, and because they're getting out of date now. However, having said that, when we tested these search strategies, filters, whichever terminology you want to use, really. The sensitivity ranged from 72% to 100%. Obviously, 100% is brilliant, but 72%, that you're missing still 28% of the literature, so not as acceptable. So I would like to do a quiz. It's not a trick, it's just to see what people think the best search term, well, most sensitive search term was when we looked in 27 systematic reviews of drug interventions. So I'd like you to think which you think it would be. So which search term would retrieve the highest number of relevant records in MEDLINE? I say these were for drug interventions. Do you think it was A, adverse effects as a floating subheading, B, adverse ADJ3, which means adjacent 3, so within 3 words of event, truncated, so it also picks up events in the title and abstract, or C, safety in the title or abstract? So over to you, Chris, to open up the poll to see what people think.
Righto, okay, so let me just launch that for you. Okay, so everybody should be able to see that now, I think. Just give you a few seconds, everybody, to answer that. Just a couple more seconds, last couple of answers. Okay, and this is going to be interesting. So I'm going to share these results for you, Sue, so you can see those. Can you see those okay?
No.
Okay. Okay, I can tell you what they are then. Let me read them out.
Just let me know.
So yep. for the A, adverse effects, A is a floating subheading, 43%. That was the top answer.
Right.
Adverse ADJ3 event in a title or abstract, 33%. That was the second answer. And safety in a title or abstract, 25%.
25%. Brilliant. Thank you. Well, you're all correct in that you got it in the right order as a group. So in actual fact, A was the best performing in terms of sensitivity, followed by B, followed by C, which as a group is what you came up with. So here we can see that adverse effects as a floating subheading retrieved 51% of the included studies in those 27 systematic reviews. Adverse events in the title abstract, 32%, and safety, 31%. So as you can see, no one term actually found 100% of records. So this just shows that you've got to think of synonyms, you've got to think of different ways of searching. You can't just rely on one line, one entry search. Now if we look at MBase, the floating subheadings again performed the best and actually performed better than the subheadings in MEDLINE. MBase tends to index more, so some people accuse MBase of over-indexing, and this might be a contributory factor. But as you can see, again, subheadings performed best. Now, I did mention that those the reviews that we used in that sample were actually drug intervention reviews. And I've already mentioned that when looking at the indexing terms for drug interventions, they actually differ from medical devices, for example, in surgery. So it's not surprising that the terms for medical device interventions varies as opposed to the drug interventions. So just to give you an indication, We looked at the most sensitive search terms in MEDLINE for a medical device. Although adverse effects, the floating subheading, again performed the best, we had terms such as complication and post-operative complication. It was actually a medical device that was implemented via surgery. So you can see that it gives a different hierarchy of terms. And the same was for MBase. For medical devices, we had complication as a floating subheading as the most sensitive search term, followed by complication in the title and abstract. So as you can see, different terms. So you need to think about what type of intervention you've got.